SoundCartel. In this episode, we talk to Spotify's podcast partner manager here in Australia, Prithi Dey, about Spotify's bold podcasting plans and how creators and brands can benefit.
We're also able to deliver data-driven insights and solutions. So Spotify for Podcasters helps podcast creators engage with and understand their listeners from all things from finding new fans, discovering insights, to actually being able to understand which music artists are listening to their podcasts.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 13 of season 4. And as always, I'm joined by producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hey Nick, so looking forward to hearing about Spotify's big push into podcasting in what's been a relatively short amount of time. But before we do that, another huge player has entered the podcasting space.
Yes, there sure has. Amazon Music now includes podcasts, and you don't get much bigger than Amazon.
Nope.
So that really just further ratifies that podcasting is the real deal when the likes of Amazon join Spotify, Apple and others. But Amazon has 55 million users globally, so it's great news for podcasters because Amazon will be exposing podcasts to a huge audience that are not currently listening to podcasts.
Yeah, it's fantastic news, but very early days. Amazon have already mentioned that some big exclusive shows are coming up, so let's just watch this space.
Yes, watch indeed. But now, before we get to our chat with Spotify about their big plans, you want to quickly go through some headlines from Westwood One's latest report.
I do, Nick. The background to this report is that advertisers are starting to take notice of the growing podcast audiences. And so with 2 out of 3 advertising media decision makers having discussed advertising in podcasts, Westwood One decided to commission another podcast study to track trends and in particular to see what the effect of COVID-19 has been on the industry.
And what did they find?
Well, they found that podcast listening is pandemic-proof. Since COVID-19, over 90% of weekly podcast listeners reported spending about the same or more time with podcasts. Now, this presents a huge opportunity. 12% of weekly podcast listeners started listening just in the last 6 months. Also, there was a rise in weekly podcasters becoming heavy podcast listeners, which means they listen to more than 6 hours a week. And of course, the heavy podcast listenership continues to grow.
Yeah, 2 really great points there. That on the first one, that there's new podcast listeners coming in all the time, which is fantastic because those listeners won't have a whole slate of podcasts that they already listen to. So there's a good opportunity for you to get share of their ear. And also, it shows that once you do become a podcast listener, you quite quickly move into that heavy category, which means you are listening to more and more podcasts, which of course is a great opportunity as well.
That's right. It's addictive once you get started. And another fact is that podcast newcomers are starting to skew younger and female. And of course, as we know, Nick, the top reasons weekly podcast listeners tune into podcasts are to be entertained and to learn.
Yeah, well, there's nothing new in that one. We've often reminded listeners on this podcast about the importance of producing entertaining and educational podcasts, so it's great that the stats are backing that up.
Absolutely. There's also a growing tolerance for ads among weekly podcast listeners. Listeners are starting to recognise and appreciate the ads for making their favourite podcasts possible, Nick.
Yeah, I think I would agree just from a personal perspective on that one as well. I might not listen intently to every ad in a podcast, but I'm definitely aware of who those advertisers are, and I think of them fondly for allowing those podcasts that I love to exist.
Yeah, particularly because podcast ads don't need to follow a traditional radio format. Host-read ads in particular can be a bit fun and irreverent. And you see this in the report as well, that audiences prefer host-read ads over pre-produced ads.
You're a big fan of those host-read ads, aren't you?
I love a host-read ad. I have a couple in mind that I'm thinking of, but particularly if they're smart and funny. But overall, Nick, there's a heap of great content, all 65 pages, in fact, in this full report, which we will link to in the show notes.
Thanks, Nick. And I love the phrase that podcasting is pandemic-proof.
It's great.
I love a little bit of alliteration.
Don't we all?
But let's get to today's chat with Spotify's Prithi Dey. Prithi is a content specialist with a wealth of knowledge in production and broadcast, from experience at Universal Music Group and The Guardian to her role now as podcast partner manager at Spotify. Welcome, Prithi, to Podcasting Essentials. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Very happy to be here.
So let's kick things off with Spotify's stated goal, which is to be the #1 podcast publisher globally. So from inside the tent, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, well, I can confirm it's definitely a big priority for us. And it's actually the reason I joined Spotify, to be one of the founding members of the podcast team here in Australia. So I started here 13 months ago now, and I can confirm that it is very, very fast-paced in this world. There's a huge focus on developing and growing our robust pipeline of content with some really great talent that you've probably seen in regards to our recent acquisitions and content catalogue. On our platform, our content library is growing at a rapid rate. Spotify now has a catalogue of 1.5 million podcasts across multiple categories that include storytelling, education and wellness from diverse voices from every imaginable genre. And we're really focused on reimagining and evolving the podcast industry across the board. So from content discovery to user experience and, of course, advertising, which has long been a key driver for podcasting.
Now, Spotify is a relatively new player in the podcasting space. What attracted Spotify to podcasting?
Yeah, well, Spotify has changed the way the world discovers and shares music and listens to music. And now, a decade since our launch in 2008, we've set our sights on the world of audio beyond music. So that's especially podcasts. Our goal is to be the world's largest audio platform. And everything we do at Spotify is driven by our passion for connecting audiences to their favourite artists and creators. So as you guys well know from being in this space yourself, streaming audio is the fastest growing and most innovative and creative space in media today. So if you aren't already investing in your brand's voice and audio, it's time to get on that.
We couldn't agree more.
That's it. Prithi, there are some myths around Spotify's podcasting plans. So let's get some answers. First of all, to clarify, are all podcasts on Spotify free to access without a paid Spotify account? And are there plans to put any podcasts behind a paywall?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that, actually, because you're right. It is a myth, and we get asked about that a lot, especially as we bring big talent onto Spotify like Michelle Obama. So to clarify, you can access all our podcasts for free without a paid Spotify subscription. There is no paywall for podcasts, and I haven't heard otherwise.
Good to hear. The second myth we want to clear up is the situation with ads. Does Spotify put ads around podcast content like it does with music?
Well, advertising is very much tied to podcasting and has been since the inception. So well before Spotify got into the podcasting space, advertising has been the primary source of revenue for podcasters. So as such, we recognise that creators of podcasts make a living off these ads, so we aren't going to mess with a system that works for the creators, and we don't place ads around podcasts that aren't currently owned by Spotify.
Now, Spotify has also made some significant podcast acquisitions. What is the strategy behind this, and how many of these shows will end up being exclusively on Spotify?
Yes, so many big strategic acquisitions and exciting announcements recently that will meaningfully accelerate Spotify's ability to deliver the highest quality content and experience for listeners. So these include Anchor, which is the leading publisher for new podcasts globally, Gimlet, which is one of the best and high quality content creators in the world, Parcast, The Ringer, and of course recent partnerships with the Obamas. Spotify Studios as well is the collective group spanning all of the above, which also produces original content that will be exclusive to Spotify on a case-by-case basis. So bringing the Obamas onto Spotify, for example, will be exclusive. Joe Rogan will be exclusive from December. But some of the content that we are creating in Spotify Studios may start off exclusively on Spotify and then go to all platforms like the Wind of Change podcast, for example. So, yeah, it really depends on the podcast itself and the partnership.
Now, you mentioned Spotify is also developing original podcast content. Can you tell us how you're doing that?
Yeah, Spotify Studios produces original podcast content both in-house and in collaboration with unique partners to deliver content that will resonate with our listeners, such as comedy podcasts with comedians that will brighten up your day, or pop culture podcasts with a variety of different personalities. So locally, our strategy is about unearthing local podcast creators and working with content partners to tell stories that Australians want to hear and be a part of.
So can podcasters and creators approach Spotify with their ideas?
Yeah, definitely. There are so many great stories and ideas out there. We are very open to receiving pitches. We work extensively with a network of creators, and our preferred method is via a pitch submission form. So in terms of the strategy behind creating content locally, it obviously stems from having a great idea with the audience in mind and content gaps that we could potentially fill. That is the lens that we tend to look at new pitches through.
Now, what are the benefits to creators of distributing their podcast through Spotify?
Well, there are so many benefits, as I'm sure you expected me to say. But for example, enabling and empowering audio creators at all levels to share their art with a global audience. So from recording to editing, distribution to monetization, we're giving creators the tools to express themselves and build an audience across the borders. We're also able to deliver data-driven insights and solutions. So Spotify for Podcasters helps podcast creators engage with and understand their listeners, from all things from finding new fans, discovering insights, to actually being able to understand which music artists are listening to their podcasts.
It is really important, actually, that something that Spotify has been delivering for a long time now in podcasting is that ability to really drill down into the demographics of the people that are listening to your podcast, which is something that's taken a while for other providers to be able to give back to creators. So, yeah, it's really good.
It's really exciting. The data available to the podcasts on the platform, we've had really great feedback from creators that they can access data that they can't get anywhere else, like not just the demographics, but also locations of their listeners as well.
So then how does Spotify work with creators to help discoverability of their podcasts? Are there opportunities to feature podcasts within the Spotify app, for example?
Yeah, so we have a listener base of over 270 million users, and our unique combination of machine learning and a dedicated team of actual humans will drive discovery for podcast users. And as with new pitches, we have a submission process which creators can use to put forward their podcast to be reviewed, to be featured. The way that usually works is creators will often contact us directly, and we're happy to share that submission form with them. And as the catalogue continues to grow, effective personalisation helps audiences to navigate the sea of content. There's so much content out there, and discoverability is definitely a challenge. So I think that's something that we're very focused on at Spotify, is making it a lot easier for creators to be found on our platform.
Now, Prithi, what are the genres of podcasts that are performing the best right now on Spotify?
Well, we can see from the podcast charts that true crime is consistently popular. It was definitely my gateway into podcasts with Serial, as I think a lot of people can probably relate to, along with also comedy, news, influencer talk-driven talk shows like Hamish and Andy and Shameless. And we saw definitely when COVID hit and people went into lockdown that there was an uptick in well-being content and also content for kids and families who were suddenly forced to spend a lot of time together.
Moving to brands now that are looking to get into podcasting, do you have any advice on the best way they can get cut through with a branded podcast?
Yeah, this is actually a great question, because my background or my previous role was actually managing a branded content team at The Guardian. So I definitely have some advice there. But I think it's fair to say that each brand will have its own unique challenges, but they also have their own unique strengths in that they understand the content that their audience want. So a good branded podcast is not that different from any other podcast. It's about enabling conversations that resonate with the audience that want to hear and learn about it. So my advice is very much keep it authentic, genuine, and understand your target audience.
Very well said.
Very important.
Now, final question. Spotify continues to make bold moves in the industry, a number of which you've mentioned already. Can you share any news of what's coming up next?
Well, we are still only in 92 markets with originals and exclusives coming out of 17 for starters. We're in partnerships with the likes of the Obamas, Esther Perel, Addison Rae, and there will be some exciting things coming from our DC Comics partnership. So this is very much just the beginning of things that you will see and hear from Spotify. So stay tuned.
That all sounds fantastic. Prithi, thank you so much for your time today and for taking the time to talk with us, and all the very best at Spotify.
Thank you, Prithi. It's been fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Spotify certainly isn't planning on taking a backward step in their goal to be the biggest podcast publisher globally, are they?
No, they're not. There are so many opportunities for creators and brands. We've said it many times before, Nick, but it is a platform that you simply can't ignore when you come to distribute your podcast.
No, that's right. And for creators, I think Spotify is a fabulous platform. Like we said in the interview, that they are not only that they're helping with discoverability, but they're also giving a lot back to publishers in the insights and analytics that we can see on the listeners to our podcast on Spotify.
Yeah, very true.
But that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
No worries, Nick. Always my pleasure.
To find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at SoundCartelAU. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.